Long ago, amongst the countless sleepy villages dotting the Irish countryside, there lived a vile, mean drunk, known simply as Stingy Jack. He was a lecherous, deceitful person, a known philanderer, a card cheat, constantly in debt to one fellow or another. He spent most of his days and nights in taverns or with loose women. One night, Jack was stumbling home from an alehouse, as he so often did. He took a shortcut through the woods on this cloudy evening, the sparse moonlight barely lighting his path home. He shuddered in the cool autumn breeze and pulled his coat tighter around him, belching loudly. This had been a particularly dismal night at the pub. He'd won a few coins playing cards, then promptly lost them right back, and then he'd been tossed out onto the street like a common beggar for causing a commotion when he was accused of cheating. Ironic, he thought to himself, since for once he was actually playing the game fairly. But that's what happens. Try to be an honest man, and some scoundrel will soon take advantage. On top of everything, his ale didn't seem to be sitting right with him. His head was pounding, more so than usual, and his bowels churned. He lurched forward with an uneven gait, steadying himself momentarily against a tree. A good night's sleep would do him well. That's it. Just need some sleep, he muttered to himself. Jack came to a fork in the path in those dreary, dark woods, and as he pondered which direction to go, he spotted something near a tree. A dark shape. Was it a pile of junk? Jack rubbed his eyes and blinked. No, an animal. He slowly crept towards the shape, and as he drew nearer, he realized what it was. The body of a man, a corpse, vile and half-rotted, lying face down in the mud. It looked as though animals had already begun to feast on the tissue of this poor wretch. Jack pulled the collar of his coat over his mouth and nose in a feeble attempt to block the horrible stench. Suddenly, with a grotesque crunching and cracking, the head of the corpse began to slowly turn towards Jack, the rest of the body remaining still, until the head had turned completely backwards to face him. Jack gasped in fright and clumsily stumbled backwards. The dead man's face wore a distorted grin, and his eyes gleamed like coins. "I've been expecting you, Jack," the corpse spoke, now rising to its feet, bones clacking and rotted flesh squishing against itself. The body turned itself around, and as it did so, the head slowly turned to face Jack as well, making that same disgusting, grinding, crunching noise. "You know who I am, don't you?" the dead man asked as he shambled forwards. Jack, frozen as he was with ferocious fright, could not answer. It was as though his tongue, his entire mouth, was frozen in terror. Aghast, he looked on as the corpse began to walk with a more normal gait. He was soon completely upright, and in fact almost looked alive. Suddenly it dawned on Jack, this was a trick of the devil. It had to be. Satan himself had paid him a visit, and Jack knew that could only mean one thing. His gruesome demise was close at hand. The Legend of Stingy Jack, a bite-sized fright. This series contains disturbing content. Listener discretion is advised. "Satan," Jack managed to stammer forth. "Yes," the corpse replied. "Pay no mind to this disguise." Satan gestured towards himself, pacing in a circle around Jack. "You know why I'm here, I suspect." Jack did know the reason. His life of debauchery and wickedness had finally caught up to him, and the devil was here for his soul, to drag him away to hell. "Think, damn you!" Jack's mind raced, suddenly becoming surprisingly clear, perhaps from the sheer terror and impending sense of doom. I understand, but first, I beseech you, please allow me one final request." Satan raised one crooked eyebrow quizzically. Jack noticed that he was no longer conversing with an animated corpse. The disguise that the devil had previously worn had now given way to another form. It had happened so gradually that Jack had scarcely noticed, but now he found himself talking with a tall, thin man, exuding malevolence and dressed in a dark cloak, quite different indeed from the dead fellow Jack had come across earlier. Bemused by Jack's surprise at these dark arts, Satan suddenly snarled, almost as if spitting out every word.
"A final request? What is it?"
"A drink, you devil. One last drink. You can give me that at least," Jack answered. Satan chuckled.
"One last drink," he repeated. "A drunkard to the end. Very well. I know just the place."
Jack and his demonic companion arrived at an out-of-the-way tavern some time later. The old wooden tables inside the filthy pub were littered here and there with patrons slumped over in their chairs, sleeping off the night's festivities. "We're closed," a man behind the bar called out gruffly.
"You'll make an exception this time,"
the devil replied, and the man simply nodded and produced a mug of ale, the foul-looking swill sloshing onto the bar as Jack took his seat.
"Drink up now,"
Satan sneered at Jack. The latter gulped the ale down as slowly as he could, buying himself a few more precious minutes, turning his predicament over and over in his mind. At last, he had it. "We must pay the man for the drink," Jack announced matter-of-factly. "But I have no coin. You see, I lost it all gambling earlier this evening." Satan studied Jack's face, tilting his head slightly.
"And?"
he asked. "I thought you might turn yourself into a piece of silver, so that we might pay for my drink. Let me at least pay for my final drink and allow me some small dignity." Satan frowned at Jack.
"As you wish,"
he grumbled, and in the next instant a silver coin appeared in Jack's hand. "I have him now," Jack thought. He quickly stuffed the coin into his pocket, right next to a rosary. Satan was trapped in his current form, imprisoned by the holy object.
"Curse you!"
Jack heard Satan's voice inside his head, though he did not speak aloud.
"Damn you, foul trickster!"
the devil continued. Jack slipped outside the tavern, meandering down the dirt path, away from the small village. "I'll make you a deal, demon. Allow me my soul for 10 more years. Let me be free for 10 years, then you may take me. Agree to this, and I shall release you." Satan growled. He knew he'd been bested by this cheating scoundrel. In a way, he admired him for it. After all, a sly trick was a sly trick, even when it was played on the devil himself. Or perhaps that indeed made this deception particularly clever, for few men had ever bested the angel of darkness when it came to battles of wits.
"Fine, very well," Satan rasped. 10 years, and that is all. Now, release me."
Jack removed the rosary from his pocket, and in a blinding flash, the devil vanished into thin air. For nearly 10 long years, Jack roamed from village to village, winding his way along the countryside roads, thieving his way through life, drinking heavily and cavorting with women of questionable morals, at least those who weren't repulsed by the very sight of him or by his personality. For indeed, any lasses with any sort of sense knew full well that they should stay far away from Jack the drunkard if they knew what was good for them. With the years, Jack's health had begun to deteriorate, and the hangovers seemed to last longer than they used to. One day, on the way home from the tavern, as Jack approached the small, ramshackle hovel that he called his home, he suddenly collapsed, completely without warning. Clutching his chest, he rolled over, staring up into the black, starless night. His heart had given out, and with a final, rasping breath, Jack was dead. In his final, fleeting moments, Jack had managed to smile, knowing that he'd beaten Satan. The devil hadn't had time to collect on their bargain. His soul was free. But he soon realized that his initial optimism had been for naught. For heaven would not have a scoundrel such as Jack. His life of wickedness had made it impossible for him to gain admission to such a holy place. And who was waiting for Jack as he left the gates of St. Peter despondently after being denied entrance into God's kingdom? Who but his old friend, Satan?
Hello again, Jack,
the devil said with a grin.
A pleasure to see you. I'll bet you thought I'd forgotten our little deal after all this time, but...
He tapped the side of his head with a long, crooked fingernail. Then his malicious eyes turned to narrow slits.
I never forget, he growled.
Suddenly, Jack stood naked somewhere in a hazy, unearthly plain. The space around him was simultaneously both confining and limitless. He looked around him. Murky shapes and visions swirled in the distance, but he could not make out what they were. Was he in hell? It didn't look like it. This was nothing like the visions of hell conjured up by the stories he'd heard as a little boy. He had always imagined lakes of fire, craggy rock spires, steam bellowing from bottomless pits filled with the writhing souls of the wicked. Still, he could see no other explanation. I suppose I'm in hell, he said plainly, to no one in particular. From somewhere, a guttural cackle filled the air.
Not quite. I've got other plans for you, my friend.
Then a familiar, cloaked figure appeared before Jack. Satan again. The devil smiled a twisted, ugly grin, then turned away from Jack, slowly pacing around the vast, empty space about them.
But first, I have a gift, he called out. This burning ember, you'll need it to light your path.
The devil held out his hand, presenting a smoldering stone glowing with wicked hellfire. Jack didn't understand. What is this? Why? He stared at the festering rock, transfixed by its glow.
Take it,
Satan barked, gnashing his teeth. Startled, Jack took the coal in his hand. It burned, the awful stench of singed flesh wafting into the air. Strangely, he could not let it go. He winced as the jagged edges of the rock seared the palm of his hand. The devil then produced a gourd, crudely carved with a grotesque face, handing it to Jack.
Place the stone inside, you fool, and be grateful for this lantern which I have provided you.
Jack dropped the smouldering lump into the gourd, its monstrous, hollow, jagged face illuminated by the unholy red glow.
As I promised, I shall not take your soul, but the so-called Lord above will also not have you, Satan crowed. And so you shall walk the plane between the worlds of the living and the dead for all eternity. Rest will be forever beyond your reach. You shall roam the void alone for all time, with loneliness and despair as your sole companions.
Jack stared down at the flickering gourd, its misshapen face seemingly mocking him.
It's not so bad, Jack,
the devil chortled with glee.
On All Hallows Eve, you may even scare a few mortals. Perhaps you'll even frighten someone to death. That sounds like something that a man of your temperament would find amusing indeed.
Satan cackled, and then he was gone. Jack stood alone,
save for his crude lantern in an endless void, a world with no clear name of its own, which lay between the world of the living and that of the dead. The devil's snarling laugh still rang in his head. He took a few futile looks around him, then shuffled off aimlessly into the hanging fog, not knowing the direction in which he walked, the flickering light from the gourd burning eternally in the endless darkness. The story you just heard is inspired by the legend of Stingy Jack, also known as Jack the Smith, Drunk Jack, and perhaps most famously, Jack of the Lantern. There are many versions of this tale. In some of them, Jack is a clever blacksmith, in others, simply a common thief. However, the events in these tales always end up in much the same way, and the ending is nothing if not sinister and devoid of hope. Jack is doomed by Satan to wander the earth for all time, serving as a warning to others. He has become associated with All Hallows' Eve, Halloween, as it is called in modern times, since, on Halloween night, the veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead is at its weakest, and allegedly, many spirits of the netherworld can be seen roaming the lands of mortals. It is also thought that the jack-o'-lantern has its origins in this story, although in the original version of this ancient legend, the lantern Jack carries is actually fashioned out of a turnip, or in some versions, a rutabaga, rather than out of the pumpkins people carve these days, as they celebrate not only autumn, but also commemorate the tragic tale of Stingy Jack, despite many being wholly unaware of doing so. Halloween and pumpkins have long been intrinsically linked to one another. The custom of carving a jack-o'-lantern during the Halloween season has its roots in 19th century Ireland, as well as parts of the Scottish Highlands. Turnips were hollowed out and carved into the likeness of hideous faces during this time, when the festival of Samhain, an Irish word meaning the end of summer, also took place. Spirits of nature, goddesses, gods, and the souls of the dead were all thought to roam the earth this time of year, and the lanterns either represented these supernatural beings or were used to ward off evil spirits, thus protecting mortals from harm. Placing a jack-o'-lantern in the window of your house, for instance, was believed to protect your home from evil, as the radiant glow of such a lantern could intimidate any supernatural beings who might be passing by, and strike enough terror into them that they dared not cross your threshold. The fearsome headless horseman from Washington Irving's 1820 short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which we covered in a previous episode of Bite-Sized Frights, aptly entitled Sleepy Hollow, is often depicted carrying either a pumpkin or a carved jack-o'-lantern in place of his missing head. However, the first usage of the term jack-o'-lantern, which is used to describe a carved pumpkin in American English, was not recorded until 1834. Late in the 19th century, jack-o'-lanterns began to be commonly associated with Halloween in North America, along with the custom of masks. By then, carving pumpkins had long been a tradition of the harvest season. Pumpkins and harvest have long gone hand in hand. This is not too surprising, since after all, pumpkins have existed for nearly 10,000 years, perhaps for even longer, according to some historians, and carving faces into such gourds was not merely done for decorative purposes, but often with highly practical intentions, shielding those in possession of such items from harm. The rumors of jack-o'-lanterns protecting the living from the undead remained pervasive for many centuries. Some people even believed that the power of such pumpkins-turned lanterns could fend off vampires, as the bloodthirsty creatures' identities could be revealed by the mysterious light seeping through the grotesque, carved faces on said gourds. Jack-o'-lanterns in modern times come in many different shapes, sizes, and colors, many of them whimsical,
others frightening, and some carved into the likenesses of celebrities, horror movie villains, haunted houses, to mention only a few of the endless other designs that are frequently seen nowadays. Synthetic pumpkins that can be carved and displayed for years are a big seller during the autumn months, and pumpkins are also often used to provide scarecrows with creepy heads befitting the Halloween season. The costumes and masks worn this time of year frequently incorporate pumpkins and jack-o'-lanterns as well. We've covered the tradition of masks, and pumpkin masks specifically, in our previous episode, Malevolent Masks. A jack-o'-lantern is one of the 3 deadly mask designs in the 1982 film Halloween 3: Season of the Witch, and the devastating evil power in these masks is activated by virtue of a flashing jack-o'-lantern accompanied by a sinister song, which is broadcast to television sets all over the world. Not all carved pumpkins are created equal, and this goes not only for their highly variable appearance, but also when it comes to their evil intentions, or, sometimes, lack thereof. One of the more benevolent jack-o'-lantern-based characters appears in the book The Marvelous Land of Oz by author L. Frank Baum. A character called Jack Pumpkinhead initially makes his appearance in this story as a puppet of sorts, created by an orphan boy who intends to scare the evil witch Mombi, who is his guardian. However, Mombi instead uses the opportunity to test out her magical arts in the form of an enchanted power which brings the pumpkin creature to life. Jack Pumpkinhead eventually found his way into a film adaptation of the events from 1985 called Return to Oz. On the topic of film adaptations of the Jack Pumpkinhead character, he also inspired the protagonist from the legendary 1993 animated film The Nightmare Before Christmas, Jack Skellington, the Pumpkin King. Both Jack Pumpkinhead and Jack Skellington are portrayed as brave and heroic, far removed from the nefarious Stingy Jack and his shadowy deals with the malevolent Prince of Darkness. Movie representations of characters based on the more unseemly side of the jack-o'-lantern spectre are not difficult to find. One such movie character appears in the 2007 anthology horror film Trick or Treat. In this movie, and true to its name, a mysterious trick-or-treater named Sam appears on Halloween night wearing a sack over his head, hell-bent on enforcing the rules of Halloween. Once his mask is removed, Sam is revealed to have a grotesque pumpkin-shaped head with orange flesh and crooked teeth resembling a jack-o'-lantern. It is also revealed that Sam's insides are made entirely out of pumpkin guts. Now that we have shared this information, we are aware that it is quite possible that Stingy Jack, or perhaps even Sam, will soon come knocking on our own doors as payback for our spoiling a little part of the movie we just mentioned. Perhaps we should carve a pumpkin of our own in order to fend off such eerie entities. In another horror anthology film, Tales of Halloween, the final story tells the tale of flesh-hungry jack-o'-lanterns, which began to spring up everywhere, ferociously devouring the heads of unlucky human victims on a decidedly deadly Halloween night. The jack-o'-lantern has become synonymous with Halloween, a fun symbol of a festive season for many, and a grim element of numerous horror movies for others. Yet its origins remain mysterious and even sinister. When it comes to many movies that take place on or around Halloween, their depictions of jack-o'-lanterns have become iconic and instantly recognizable to fans. The distinctive pumpkin featured in the opening credits of John Carpenter's 1978 film Halloween, for instance, is almost as legendary as the murderous Michael Myers himself. What do you think? Could a carved gourd really ward off evil spirits or even frighten away vampires? Does a wretched creature named Stingy Jack still endlessly roam the void between the worlds of the living and the dead? Or was Jack's story merely a tall tale, invented by adults to scare their children into pious lives, a warning against falling into the traps of Satan? As is often the case with such legends, perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Whatever the case may be, do take care on Halloween night. Carve a jack-o'-lantern and place it upon your windowsill, just in case, and be on the lookout for a fellow with a crudely shaped lantern lit by a piece of brimstone. Perhaps then you shall remain safe from harm, at least until next Halloween. We would love to hear your own thoughts and ideas about the sinister Stingy Jack and the petrifying pumpkins of the Halloween tradition. If you have enjoyed this episode, please follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Pixel Elixir, and at Instagram at Bite-Sized Frights. You can also subscribe at bitesizedfrights.com so that you never miss any of our terrifying tales. This has been a Pixel Elixir production, narrated by Chris K. Thank you for listening. Until the next bite, my friends.